Bonjour à tous et bienvenue à cette conférence de presse. Welcome to all to this press conference on the Conservative Shadow Cabinet members to respond to the tabling of the Auditor General's COVID-19 performance audit reports. We have quite a few Member of Parliaments and Conservative shadow ministers, so perhaps I will let them introduce themselves. I have on my list John Williamson, Pierre Paulus, Jasraj Halan, and excuse me. And I think that is it on my list, but I'll let you guys introduce yourself. Je vous laisse vous présenter et prendre chacun la parole. We will have a few remarks and then we will go on questions, first in the room and then on Zoom. So if you're attending on Zoom, please use the raise hand function at this point. Vous pouvez utiliser la fonction lever la main sur Zoom et nous vous donnons la parole après quelques questions dans la salle. So on that, the floor is yours, Shadow Ministers.
Kelly Block, Member of Parliament for Saskatchewan. I'm also the Shadow Minister for Public Services and Procurement.
Good morning, Dr. Steve Ellis. I'm a Member of Parliament for Cumberland, Colchester, Nova Scotia, and the Shadow Minister for Health.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jasraj Singh Hullan. I'm the Shadow Minister for Finance, as well as a Member of Parliament for Calgary Forest Lawn.
Bonjour, Pierre Paulus, député de Charlebourg-Saint-Charles, lieutenant politique pour le Québec.
Hello, I'm Tracy Gray, Member of Parliament for Kelowna Lake Country, and I'm the Shadow Minister for Workforce Development, Employment, and Disability Inclusion.
Good afternoon, Adam Chambers, Simcoe North, CRA.
So do you want to have a few remarks and then we'll go to questions? What about that?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Today, the Auditor General confirmed what Conservatives have been warning about since 2020. Wasteful spending due to a lack of controls, as identified by the Auditor General, has contributed to the cost of living crisis we see today. This is a pattern, and the Liberals never learn and continue to make the same mistakes. Canadians are suffering as a result. The Auditor General found that Employment and Social Development Canada established performance standards by focus solely on the speed of payment and identified that at least $32 billion in overpayments and suspicious payments that require further investigation. The lack of controls put in place by the Liberal government, as identified by the Auditor General, undoubtedly contributed to this mess that taxpayers will be forced to pay. As the Leader of the Opposition, Pierre Poilievre, said back in April of 2020, government should never punish or limit work. The Auditor General confirmed today certain measures negatively affected small businesses and the economy by disincentivizing work. Canadians are struggling with 40-year highs in inflation and unprecedented labor shortages. 1 in 5 Canadians are skipping meals. 1.5 million Canadians are visiting food banks in a single month, half of which are children. Credit card debt is at a record high, and it takes 67% of income to service a traditional mortgage, and average rent across Canada is nearly $2,000 a month. Inflationary waste is driving up the cost of living, and yet the Liberals are determined to double down on this failed inflationary approach with current and future programs. Canadians are out of money, and this government is out of touch.
Merci, Jazz. Donc, bonjour tout le monde. Aujourd'hui, la vérificatrice générale a confirmé ce que les conservateurs affirment depuis 2020. Le gaspillage financier dû à un manque de contrôle, tel qu'identifié par la vérificatrice générale, a contribué à la crise du coût de la vie. C'est une tendance, et les libéraux prouvent qu'ils refusent d'apprendre de leurs erreurs en continuant de les répéter. Résultat, les Canadiens en souffrent. La vérificatrice générale a constaté que Emploi et Développement social Canada avait établi des normes de rendement qui étaient uniquement axées sur la rapidité des paiements et a identifié au moins 32 milliards de dollars en trop payés et en paiements suspects qui nécessitent une enquête approfondie. Le manque de contrôle du gouvernement libéral, tel qu'identifié par la vérificatrice générale, a sans aucun doute contribué à ce gâchis que les contribuables seront forcés de rembourser. Comme l'a dit le chef de l'opposition, Pierre Poilievre, en avril 2020, le gouvernement ne devrait jamais punir ou limiter le travail. La vérificatrice générale a confirmé aujourd'hui que certaines mesures ont eu l'effet négatif sur les petites entreprises et l'économie en décourageant le travail. Les Canadiens sont aux prises avec le taux d'inflation le plus élevé en 40 ans et des pénuries de main-d'œuvre sans précédent. Un Canadien sur 5 saute des repas. 1,5 million de Canadiens font appel aux banques alimentaires en un seul mois, dont la moitié sont des enfants. Les dettes de carte de crédit atteignent un niveau record. Il faut 67 du revenu pour rembourser une hypothèque normale et le loyer moyen. On est près de 2 000 $ par mois. Le gaspillage inflationniste fait grimper le coût de la vie. Et pourtant, les libéraux sont déterminés à maintenir cette approche inflationniste défaillante avec les programmes actuels et futurs. Les Canadiens n'ont plus d'argent et ce gouvernement est déconnecté de la réalité. Merci. Stéphane, you want to talk about it?
Good afternoon, everyone. Very clearly, the report from the Auditor General makes a statement around the unsuccessful efforts of PHAC to minimize vaccine wastage. Early estimates by the end of 22 would suggest that almost $2 billion worth of COVID-19 vaccines have expired or will expire by the end of the year. We also know very clearly that Vaccine Connect is another expensive government data program which has failed to live up to its price tag. $37.4 million of a $59 million contract has been spent as of May 2022 on a system that was delayed by technical flaws and being partially functional until June of 2021. The delays in developing key system capabilities within Vaccine Connect force PHAC employees to often use spreadsheets to manually track data. Employees will still using these spreadsheets after Vaccine Connect was partially functional. While advanced purchase agreements is a prudent approach in procuring vaccines, not having a data sharing capability resulted in significant waste. Finally, the report found the Trudeau government did not meet its international commitments on vaccine provision. Of the 50.6 million surplus doses that have been earmarked to be donated internationally, only 15.3 million were delivered. Once again, we see this Trudeau Liberal government failing Canadians, failing from a wasteful and sadly financially wasteful position. Thank you.
Donc, en français, sur le rapport concernant les vaccins, l'Agence de la santé publique a été clairement identifiée et blâmée concernant l'échec à gérer le gaspillage. On a pour environ 2 milliards de dollars en valeur de vaccins qui ont été perdus ou qui sont sur le point d'être expirés. Donc, c'est 2 milliards là-dessus. Également, l'application COVID. Le contrat, il y a 37,4 millions qui ont été dépensés sur le 59 millions prévus. Et cette application-là était non fonctionnelle, a créé plus de problèmes que d'autres choses. Et c'est un autre problème de gaspillage de fonds publics mal géré. Et en tout dernier lieu, un échec au niveau du transfert de vaccins qu'on devait faire comme partenaire à travers le monde. On a 50,6 millions de doses qui devaient être redistribuées et actuellement seulement 15,3 millions l'ont été par manque de gestion, manque de capacité à contrôler les inventaires et à refaire la distribution comme il était prévu. Donc, on est prêt pour les questions. Merci.
Merci. On va passer aux questions dans la salle et ensuite sur Zoom. Donc, n'hésitez pas à garder vos questions peut-être courtes et les réponses courtes pour en passer le plus possible. So we'll start in the room. Stephanie Levitz, Toronto Star. Do you want to start up?
Thanks for being here and taking our questions. My first question is to you, Dr. Ellis, on the vaccine element of the report. I wondered if you could reflect perhaps on the juxtaposition between the government in the early days taking doses from the COVAX facility in order to fulfill demand at home. I mean, there was so much political demand for vaccines, including by your own party, that they went to COVAX, and then juxtaposing that with the fact that we let a lot of vaccines apparently expire without being able to give them to people in the world who might need them.
Well, thank you very much, Stephanie, for that question. Certainly, we know that early on, the COVAX program was designed to be a worldwide program to benefit all nations, including developing nations, supported by those nations that have much more funding. And sadly, this Trudeau Liberal government not only created contracts outside of that program, but also then, as you correctly point out, dipped into that program, taking 1.9 million doses from developing countries. And certainly what we see then is this overbuying of vaccines, which again, as we clearly know from today, has resulted in almost $2 billion worth of wasteful spending. Spending that Canadians cannot afford to have this government undertake, which contributes to, as we very well know, 40-year high inflation levels, and then difficulties with, of course, 20% of Canadians not having appropriate nutrition, and 1.5 million Canadians in 1 month having to visit food banks. It's a sad state of affairs for Canadians.
And then just on my follow-up, though, on the same subject, perhaps why were the vaccine doses wasted at home? Was it people were not willing to take the vaccines, they didn't ask for the vaccines, or is it that both parties, yours and the government, politicized the issue to an extent that the vaccine take-up didn't work?
Well, thank you for that, Stephanie. And what we know very clearly from what has happened is part of the difficulty is tracking the vaccines. We have this program called Vaccine Connect, which the government spent almost $60 million on. Its functionality wasn't completely used, and we heard very clearly from the Auditor General that many employees were still using Excel spreadsheets to try to track the data. This is an issue that the Auditor General would say has been brought up many times over the last quarter century, that this government needs to be more precise in terms of following things like vaccines and their rollout and understand exactly where they are. And certainly there's no ability to track this as those vaccines get to provinces, and even on the global market creates more of an issue for that. So again, it's about understanding where we're spending our money and understanding very clearly that vaccines are money at $30 a dose at least, and then understanding that money of that $2 billion, again, is not available for other programs and has to, of course, come out of the pockets of Canadians.
Thank you. Louis Blouin, Radio-Canada.
Bonjour, M. Paulus. Sur les sommes versées en trop et ce montant là, de 27 milliards qui est évalué, plus que le 4,6 milliards, à partir d'aujourd'hui, c'est quoi votre demande pour le gouvernement fédéral? Il leur reste peu de temps là, pour essayer de récupérer ces sommes-là. Qu'est-ce que vous leur demandez?
Merci pour la question. Effectivement, comme on sait, comme on l'a appris dans le rapport de la vérificatrice générale, c'est que les montants qui ont été octroyés, le gouvernement a 3 ans donc pour faire les récupérer. Et là, ce qui est le blâme que la vérificatrice générale a amené, c'est que le gouvernement prend trop de temps. Autant on était très vite à distribuer, autant actuellement c'est très lent. On dirait qu'il y a un manque de volonté de vouloir vraiment récupérer les sommes. On sait qu'il y a différents types. Il y a la PCU, il y a les aides aux entreprises, il y a différents types d'aides qui ont été données. On peut comprendre qu'il y a des sommes données à des individus, à des personnes qui n'ont peut-être pas nécessairement les moyens de rembourser ce qu'ils ont reçu, c'est une chose. Mais au niveau des entreprises, il y a énormément de sommes qui ont été distribuées qui ne devraient pas avoir été données. Et là-dessus, lorsqu'on parle d'entreprise, je pense qu'il y a moyen d'aller plus loin au niveau du gouvernement et de façon plus rapide. Par contre, d'un autre côté, on a aussi appris qu'il y avait un problème, vraiment un problème, négligence au début. Donc, on n'a pas demandé vraiment aux entreprises de fournir les numéros de TPS et BQ. Pour le Québec, on n'a pas demandé d'avoir les numéros d'assurance sociale. Donc, ce qui fait en sorte que les moyens de contrôle ne sont pas là. Et on a une idée, la vérificatrice générale mentionne qu'elle a une idée des montants, mais pas capable d'expliquer d'où provient l'information clairement. Donc, au niveau de l'Agence du revenu du Canada, il y a des informations disponibles, mais ce n'est pas encore clair. Est-ce qu'on sait précisément qui a reçu, quelle entreprise, par exemple, a reçu de l'argent, quel montant elle a reçu et qu'elle n'était pas éligible? Ça, c'est pas clair. Donc, on a un montant global sans avoir plus de précision. Là-dessus, évidemment qu'on demanderait de la transparence de la part du gouvernement, si on peut avoir un peu plus de transparence, de précision et de savoir si effectivement on peut récupérer ces sommes-là, qui est l'argent des Canadiens.
Est-ce qu'il faut, à votre avis, récupérer toutes les sommes versées aux particuliers? Parce que vous l'avez souligné vous-même, les gens sont endettés, il y a la crise de l'inflation. Est-ce que c'est judicieux d'aller rechercher toutes ces sommes-là alors qu'il y a des gens, effectivement, qui n'ont peut-être pas moyen de les rembourser? Alors, pour les contribuables, on fait quoi? On essaie de tout récupérer?
Les contribuables qui ont volontairement fraudé le gouvernement du Canada, c'est une chose. Les gens qui, de façon non intentionnelle, pensaient qu'ils avaient le droit aux sommes, c'est autre chose. Donc, c'est pour ça que la problématique qu'on a, c'est de faire la différence entre ceux qui ont fraudé et ceux qui ont, de façon involontaire, demandé la PCU, par exemple, en pensant qu'ils avaient droit. Ça, c'est du cas par cas, c'est très compliqué. Pour nous, à partir du moment où on a des cas clairement identifiés de personnes qui ont fraudé, qui ont délibérément demandé de la PCU, qui ont les moyens de rembourser, le gouvernement devrait faire le maximum pour avoir son remboursement. Pour les autres cas, écoutez, comme je vous dis, c'est du cas par cas, parce qu'il y a des gens qui n'étaient pas intentionnels, et ça peut être à voir.
Next up, Ryan Tumulty, National Post.
The Auditor General was in here before you guys, and when we asked her about vaccine wastage, she said the primary reason for the wastage, she mentioned the Vaccine Connect issues, but the primary reason for the wastage was that we signed 7 advance purchase agreements for tens, if not hundreds of millions of more doses than we needed. Was that a mistake? Should the government have signed fewer advance purchase agreements?
Thank you for the question. I believe that the Auditor General indicated that advanced purchase agreements is a prudent approach if you want to make sure that you have enough vaccines in order to vaccinate your population, but that the real issue was with Vaccine Connect because there was no ability to have eyes on where those vaccines were being distributed, on the expiry dates, and supply chain visibility was an issue.
She also identified when it comes to Vaccine Connect that one of the problems is provinces and territories not sharing data back with the federal government, doing so at best voluntarily and not consistently. Is that an issue that the provinces should be adapting? Should they be working better with the federal government on this file?
Well, thanks very much for that. And certainly, you know, when you look at the essential nature in 2022 of data sharing and the ability to do so, those are problems that the Auditor General has highlighted over the last 25 years. And clearly, those are things that this government needs to begin to look at now before the next pandemic hits and we see this terrible waste coming again. I think the concern, of course, that we all share as Canadians is to ensure that that data that is shared is data that's cleared of any of your own personal information. That's not the type of thing that we want to see shared in any way, shape, or form, certainly not within our country and not with the world in general. I think it also, though, points to the data sharing of other important issues around the vaccines and the rollout as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll go to Nojo Dalmalis, Canadian Press.
Hi, thanks for taking our questions. This is just a follow-up on a colleague's question, if I can get the response in English, on what would you like to see the federal government do now? They said that they partly agreed with the recommendation to recuperate money. They want to prioritize recuperating money based on how many resources it requires and how much the amounts are. So what would you like to see there? And also, if you could just clarify a little bit about whether, the Conservatives, you guys are concerned about what's happening now in terms of recuperating the money, or would you have liked to see more controls from the beginning in terms of giving this money out to people and businesses, which would have ultimately obviously slowed down the process?
Thank you for the question. It's clear in the Auditor General's report that the lack of controls was a concern, and that was a concern for us as well. And going forward, there is no transparency of a proper plan to fix that problem by the Liberals. It's highlighted in her report. So we are also calling on the Liberal government to show us a plan how they're going to address that for any current and future programs so that we don't see the same issues. These same issues are the ones that have led up to, we already know that the wasteful spending by the Liberals have led up to 40-year highs in inflation. And this is another example of that inflationary waste that is forcing more and more Canadians into food banks. And Canadians, 1 in 5 Canadians are skipping meals. And it's because of this wasteful spending. So the Conservatives are calling on the Liberals to present a plan that shows that they're going to take this report seriously and put in the controls that the Auditor General is also calling for.
And then just to follow up, you mentioned in your remarks about disincentives in terms of the pandemic supports creating disincentives for work, but the Auditor General highlights that there were controls put in place later on in later phases of the supports to kind of address those issues, but that wasn't really happening for business supports. So I'm just wondering, do you have concerns about how business supports were given up? Because ultimately, the individual supports went to mostly lower income folks, but then there are a lot of businesses that got a lot of money as well, right?
Thank you for the question. And I think the Conservatives have brought this up before, that some of the supports that were given to businesses also went to bigger corporations that ended up using the money for their to pay off shareholders, and we've brought in that concern up as well. But to the point of the disincentivizing by work, our leader was clear in April of 2020 that the $1,000 cap on people working, it disincentivized work. It punished people that wanted to continue working, and so we would have liked to seen that cap have been lifted back then. And what we see today is now, when you're looking at the numbers, there's almost 200,000 people that quit, and that's from the report. And when we see that we have a labor shortage, a crisis all across Canada that has almost 1 million job shortages, this may or may not have contributed to that as well.
Thank you. We'll go to Bill Curry, Globe and Mail.
Thanks. Maybe a question for Mr. Chambers on the CRA. There's clearly a difference of opinion between the Auditor General and the government. She described the CRA as taking the view that they treat this as they have always, that you don't go cuck. Mr. Here had just said that you just isolate high-risk cases. And she says in this situation it actually should be much more aggressive given the lack of screening at the forefront. So in terms of that disagreement between the AG and the CRA on what should be done, where is your party?
I think my colleague, both my colleagues have mentioned, I think what the Auditor General has said is the rules that we have today have an expectation that the government would pursue individuals that received improper money. But if the government wishes to take a different approach, it should be completely transparent. I think what the Auditor General's report highlights is it is now incumbent upon the government to bring forward a plan on how they intend to examine the 30 billion or 32 billion at minimum that appears to have been improperly paid out or improperly received. Obviously, and this is in addition, as a reminder, this is people who are ineligible to receive payments. It doesn't include businesses who are eligible to receive payments for which our party and other parties in the House said they shouldn't have been eligible to receive payments. There was almost $7 billion in wage subsidy paid to companies who then paid dividends. They were eligible to receive the payments and did. So you're talking about a significant amount of the total payments in the largest pandemic program, which is the wage subsidy, that is called into question about its efficacy and now the ability for the government to recover. So I think it's incumbent upon the government to bring forward a plan to say, look, here's how we prioritize. We have limited resources. Here's what we are planning to do in a fully transparent way. We can obviously then judge the government on its plan to pursue individuals who received ineligible payments.
And then maybe a follow-up for Mr. Singh. The Auditor General, when she was here, was saying if the government is considering waiving these repayments as on empathy grounds, because a lot of these people are in low-income situations, they should say so, and that might be a reasonable thing to do. Is that something that you would support?
Thank you for the question, Bill. I think what we're waiting for is a plan from the government first to see what that would include. We don't know what their plan is first, and when we see the details of that plan, that's something we can come back and analyze and see if that's something that we can fully support or not.
Thanks.
Antoine Trépanier, le droit.
J'aimerais revenir sur quelque chose que la vérificatrice générale a dit par rapport au recouvrement. Elle a dit, mot pour mot, il y a un manque de rigueur de la part du gouvernement fédéral. J'aimerais savoir, vous, dans l'opposition, quelle importance vous accordez à ce qualificatif-là, à cette phrase-là de la vérificatrice générale dans l'ensemble de ses rapports?
C'est fondamental de dire que la vérificatrice générale dit clairement qu'il y a un manque de rigueur de la part du gouvernement fédéral. Ça veut tout dire. Ça démontre comment il y a du laxisme dans l'ensemble de la gestion des programmes. Et c'est pour ça qu'aujourd'hui, on emmène le point qu'on vient de vivre une situation, qu'on avait levé un drapeau au début en 2020 en disant qu'il faudrait faire attention à mettre des balises. On s'est fait revirer de côté par les libéraux. Par la suite, là, les nouveaux programmes qui s'en viennent, on a des programmes qui sont en place et il n'y a pas de balises encore. C'est pour ça que l'avertissement de la vérificatrice générale devrait être pris en considération très rapidement. Le gouvernement doit prendre acte parce qu'à un moment donné, c'est des milliards de dollars qui sont en cause. Puis là, je vous regarde avec, vous posez vous vous demandez de quoi je parle, par exemple, le programme qui vient d'être établi pour les loyers et pour les dents pour les enfants. Le gouvernement va envoyer l'argent sans vérification. On dit, on va l'envoyer, puis après ça, on vérifiera. Mais est-ce qu'on va avoir le même problème de suivi? C'est la même chose. Donc, de mettre des balises au départ de façon claire. Et lorsqu'on parle de transparence, c'est ça. Lorsqu'on demande un plan actuellement pour récupérer les sommes qui ont été versées de façon incorrecte, ça va dans l'ordre de ce que la vérificatrice générale demande.
Alors, dans ce contexte-là, le dit plan, quel est votre niveau de confiance qu'il soit crédible et que ça parvienne à ce que vous voulez avoir?
Je peux vous dire que ça fait 7 ans que je suis ici. Ça fait 7 ans que j'ai jamais eu de preuve de transparence de la part du gouvernement libéral. On a toujours eu les mêmes questions. C'est toujours des belles paroles. Les libéraux sont très forts, le premier ministre très fort pour arriver et dire « Ah, nous, on est là pour supporter les gens. » Mais à chaque fois qu'on amène des solutions, parce qu'on est en mode aussi solution, on n'est pas juste en mode critique, comme par exemple le début de la COVID, on était là vraiment, notre chef qui était porte-parole aux finances, amener des solutions pratiques, rapides, qui n'auraient pas mis en cause la rapidité du programme, puis qui auraient évité qu'on soit à vouloir récupérer 32 milliards aujourd'hui. Justin Trudeau ne veut jamais écouter les recommandations de ce type-là. C'est la première des choses qu'il devrait faire, c'est de prendre acte quand on suggère des choses intelligentes dans l'intérêt public, on devrait nous écouter.
Follow-up, Antoine? OK, t'es fini? Bon, OK, we'll go to Tom Perry, CBC.
Hi, thanks for taking my questions. I'd just like to ask you kind of in a nutshell, what you would have done differently. Are there programs you wouldn't have brought in? Would you not have spent as much money? Would there be tighter controls? How would it have worked had your party been in power?
Thank you for the question. We know for a fact that there was a lot of wasteful spending even before the pandemic. The Liberals spent $110 billion before that, breaking their own promise of never going into a deficit more than $10 billion. During the pandemic, they spent $500 billion, where 40% of which had nothing to do with COVID. And even within COVID, they found ways of rewarding their friends. Like we saw what happened with the We Charity. We saw that they gave $237 million to a former Liberal MP for ventilators that were never used. We saw wasteful spending that went to field hospitals in the hundreds of millions of dollars that were not used again. So the Conservatives would not have let us get to this point where now we're seeing 40-year highs in inflation. We're seeing 1.5 million Canadians going into food banks. And these are the same Canadians that did everything right. And then the other thing the Conservatives would not have done is piled on a carbon tax that obviously has not helped has not reduced emissions, helped them meet a single target, yet it's sending more and more families into hardships, into food banks. So those are the steps that the Conservatives would not have taken during this time.
So do you think then that we'd be in a better economic space right now? Maybe not as much inflation, not dealing with high interest rates, all the stuff we're dealing with right now. We'd be in a better place if the federal government had not supported Canadians through the pandemic, or it supported them less through the pandemic?
I don't think it's a matter of more or less. If you see from the Auditor General's report, she clearly highlights that it was the lack of controls, and now it's the lack of transparency as well on top of that the Liberals continue to do. This is their regular trend. This is a legacy of the Liberals, that they're not learning from their own mistakes. What Conservatives are calling on is to see what kind of plan do they actually have, because no one has seen one yet, and neither has the Auditor General. That what kind of controls are they going to put in so that in the future, if any other problems come up like this again, that we're not seeing more wasteful, inflationary spending that at the end of the day, the taxpayer gets put on the hook for, just because of Liberal mismanagement.
Okay, thank you.
Mackenzie Gray from Global.
I just want to follow up on Bill's question previously. I know you're trying to put the ball in the Liberals' court, but we want to hear what your party has to say on a specific issue about repayment of CERB. You're talking about food banks, lower-income Canadians. We know that those are the people that predominantly receive, in particular, these CERB payments. Do you want to see the CRA go after lower-income Canadians to repay CERB that potentially they should not have received?
I think the issue today is that the same lower-income Canadians are the ones that are having to use the food bank. They're the most hit by this inflation that the Liberals created. Their wasteful spending over the last 7 years is the same reason why they're being driven into those food banks in the first place, where we're seeing 1 in 5 Canadians skipping meals.
So you have no position then on whether or not the CRA should try and claw that money back that the Auditor General or the CRA has deemed they should not have received?
I think the Liberals need to present a plan first, like I said before. We have not seen a plan of what they intend to do. So for us to speculate on what we would and wouldn't support, we haven't seen a plan yet from the Liberal government.
But you don't want to put a plan on the table, though?
Sorry?
You don't want to put a plan on the table on what you want to see done?
We haven't seen a plan yet. Any of you guys want to?
So I think what we're saying is these questions that are raised by the Auditor General requires the government to answer with a plan that says, look, there's $30 billion of a pot of money here that looks to be paid ineligible, requires further investigation. So what is the government's plan to deal with that $30 billion? Number one. Number two, how much is it going to cost to spend to pursue these various buckets of individuals? Then we believe you could have a thoughtful conversation on where is it most appropriate to focus the limited resources that the government has to pursue individuals. So I don't think it would be prudent to come out in the first instance without seeing any of these figures from the government to say, oh, here's what they should do and here's who they shouldn't go after and here's who they should go after. This is an answer that they have to give, that we need to, as parliamentarians, have further investigations in front of committee to ask the government what is their plan on how they intend to deal with it and how much are taxpayers going to be on the hook for the administrative costs to pursue these individuals.
Merci. I see no further question in the room. If you're on Zoom, you can use the raise hand function at this time if you want to ask a question. In the meanwhile, je vais poser une question moi-même. Boris Proulx, Le Devoir. J'aimerais savoir, ça fait 2 ans qu'on parle de programme pandémique. Ça nous a coûté 211 milliards de dollars à peu près. On apprend qu'à peu près au minimum d'une 32 milliards, vous avez dit, dans le rapport, de dépenses qui sont peut-être illégitimes. Est-ce que ça correspond à peu près au ratio que vous estimiez? Est-ce que vous pensez que ça pourrait être encore pire? Ça fait peut-être 15% là, des programmes pandémiques qui sont comme ça, peut-être pour des gens inadmissibles ou des entreprises inadmissibles. Quelle est votre appréciation globale de ce qu'on pourrait découvrir là-dedans?
Premièrement, je vous corrige parce que il y a eu 500 milliards de dépenses qui ont été faites dans les deux années pandémiques, mais il y a 200 milliards qui est inexplicable selon le directeur parlementaire du budget. Donc, il y a eu 300 milliards qui ont été consacrés à la gestion de la pandémie. Là-dessus, aujourd'hui, on a une partie des réponses parce qu'on a un traitement qui a été fait pour la partie sur l'aide aux particuliers, aux entreprises et la partie sur les vaccins. Mais la vérificatrice générale a également mentionné qu'elle n'était pas en mesure de savoir quel montant les vaccins avaient coûté. C'est de l'information qu'elle n'est pas capable d'avoir. Donc, il y a encore des zones grises actuellement dans l'ensemble des dépenses qui ont été faites pour la pandémie. Comme mon collègue a mentionné tantôt aussi, il y a des contrats très discutables qui ont été donnés, par exemple, pour les ventilateurs qui ont coûté 237 millions, qui auraient dû en coûter beaucoup moins puis qui n'ont pas servi finalement, qui dès le début, je l'avais moi-même mentionné, je ne comprenais pas d'où venait la commande d'autant de ventilateurs. C'était comme un peu inexplicable. Donc ça, il reste encore beaucoup de choses à évaluer. Aujourd'hui, oui, on peut dire que c'est environ 10 %, si on veut, du budget global, mais on n'a pas fini. Il y a d'autres dépenses en équipement qui ont été faites et qu'on n'a pas encore toutes les réponses.
Merci. That's it for me. If no one wants to ask another question, si personne d'autre a des questions, je crois que c'est le temps de mettre fin à cette conférence de presse. Thanks to all. Have a good day.